Imagine two people in the same room, looking at the exact same situation and reaching two completely opposite conclusions. One thinks the other is lazy, immature, too sensitive. The other thinks the first is rigid, out of touch, obsessed with work, and yet neither of them is wrong. They simply grew up in different worlds. And that is precisely what you are going to understand today. Because this conflict between Gen Z and millennials is not about character. It is not about intelligence. It is not even a simple story of TikTok versus Instagram. It is something far deeper, something that goes all the way back to childhood, to economic trauma, to the messages each generation received about what it means to succeed in life. And by the end of this video, you will see these judgments in a way you never imagined before. But before we go any further, let me ask you something. Have you ever felt like someone from another generation was looking at you as if you came from another planet? That feeling is about to make complete sense in just a few moments. There is something almost no one says when this subject comes up. Millennials and Gen Z do not judge each other because they dislike each other. They judge each other because they have each survived something, and around that survival they have built an entire identity, a value system, a way of seeing the world. And when someone challenges that identity, even unintentionally, the brain perceives it as a threat. Let us start with millennials, because to understand why they react the way they do toward Gen Z, we need to go back to their childhood, and right there, something essential appears. Millennials grew up in an era when people still believed in a very specific promise: work hard, be loyal, get the right degree, and everything will be fine. That promise was repeated by their parents, their teachers, by society as a whole, so they obeyed. They worked. They suffered in silence. They accepted unpaid internships, precarious jobs, impossible rents, and they kept smiling because they had been told that was the price to pay. And then the 2008 financial crisis arrived and erased everything. Savings, plans, certainties, millions of millennials found themselves holding useless degrees and colossal debt, and yet they kept going. They adapted. They reinvented their paths. They learned to survive inside a system that had broken every promise it ever made. Here is what is fundamental. This generation built its identity around silent resilience, around the idea that you do not complain, that you keep moving no matter what, that suffering is a private matter. Now imagine what a millennial feels when they watch a young person from Gen Z set boundaries openly, turn down a toxic job, talk about their mental health as if it were the most natural topic in the world, and say openly that they refuse to sacrifice their life for work. The millennial does not see someone who is balanced. They see someone who is refusing to do what they themselves did. And somewhere deep inside, that reawakens a very old wound, the wound of all those sacrifices that were never acknowledged. This is not jealousy in the strict sense. It is something more complex. It is the brain saying, if what this person is doing is normal and acceptable, then was everything I endured truly necessary? And rather than answering that question, because it is too painful, the brain prefers to reject the source of the question, which is the young person from Gen Z. But now let us turn the camera around, because Gen Z is no innocent bystander, and what they have been through is no less significant. Generation Z grew up in a world where anxiety was the default state. They watched their millennial or Gen X parents work relentlessly and still not get ahead. They grew up with social media as a permanent mirror of their existence. Every moment of their lives could be judged, commented on, compared, amplified, and they passed through their formative years with climate change, pandemics, political crises, and generalized instability as the constant backdrop. That context produced something very particular in them, a sharp awareness of the value of their energy, their time, their well-being. Gen Z does not refuse to work. Contrary to what many millennials believe, they simply refuse to lose themselves in it. They understood, often very early, that work is a means, not an identity. And that is where one of the deepest friction points lies. Millennials often fuse their identity with their work, not by choice, but because they had no other option to survive. So when Gen Z says that work does not define them, the millennial hears something unconscious. They hear that their entire identity may have had no value after all. There is another element almost no one mentions enough: the relationship with emotions, and this is perhaps where the gap is most visible. Millennials were taught to manage their emotions by compressing them, hiding them, transforming them into humor, self-deprecation, irony, because in their world, showing your emotions was seen as weakness. Gen Z grew up with an emotional vocabulary that millennials simply did not have. Words like trauma, gaslighting, red flag, burnout, social anxiety, these concepts existed before, but they were not part of everyday language. They were not taught to children. They were not normalized in daily conversations. So when a young person from Gen Z uses these terms to describe their experience, some millennials feel a kind of irritation, not because they lack empathy, but because they never had access to that language to name their own pain, and seeing someone else use it so freely can be deeply destabilizing. It is as if you had crossed a forest in total darkness, feeling your way through, getting hurt along the way, and then someone arrived with a flashlight and said that crossing that forest was easy. You would not be happy either. And yet here is what both generations still fail to see clearly. They want exactly the same things. They want to be recognized. They want their sacrifices to mean something. They want to belong to something larger than themselves. They want their way of living to be validated. The mutual judgment is not a war of values. It is a war of recognition. Each generation looks at the other and asks, "Why is your path considered valid when mine costs so much more?" And social media has turned this intimate tension into a permanent spectacle. TikTok and Instagram did not create this conflict, but they amplify it in extraordinary ways. They take the most extreme moments, the most polarizing opinions, the most emotional reactions, and push them to the top of your feed. Because the algorithm doesn't reward nuance, it rewards reaction, and judgment is one of the most powerful reactions there is. What is fascinating is that when you remove the cameras, when you remove the comments, when you put two people from these two generations into a real conversation, something surprising almost always happens. They recognize themselves in each other, because beneath the generational labels, there are human beings who are afraid, who doubt themselves, who are searching for their place in a world that is changing too fast for everyone. Millennials admire the resilience of young Gen Z people facing an even more uncertain world than the one millennials themselves knew. Gen Z admires the millennials' ability to have built something for themselves in spite of everything, without the psychological tools that the current generation has access to. Judgment disappears when understanding arrives, and understanding only arrives when we accept looking at the other person's path, not to fully validate it, but to truly comprehend it. So the next time you feel that reflex to judge someone from another generation, ask yourself just one question: what did this person go through to get here? Not to excuse them, but to understand them. Because understanding is always the beginning of something far more interesting than conflict. And if this video taught you something today, it is this: behind every judgment hides a wound, and behind every wound hides a story that deserves to be heard.